Sarah Mitchell wrapped her threadbare coat tighter against the bitter winter wind. Her fingers numb as she trudged through the frozen alley behind 5th Street, never knowing that the trembling stranger she would find collapsed against the dumpster that night was James Whitmore, heir to a $3 billion empire, who had ventured onto the streets in disguise, searching for something money could never buy. She would give him her last thermal blanket, share her final packet of instant coffee, and pull him into the abandoned maintenance room that had become her sanctuary from the cold. She would save his life with hands that had nothing left to give, never suspecting that this single act of kindness would shatter everything he believed about humanity. And that within 6 months, the freezing stranger she rescued would transform her world in ways she never dared to dream. The winter morning broke over the city like a knife edge, sharp and merciless, cutting through the thin layers Sarah Mitchell had wrapped around herself during the night. She woke at 5:30, as she always did, her breath forming small clouds in the frozen air of the abandoned maintenance room beneath the old Parker building, the place she had claimed as her own after 3 months of searching for shelter that did not reek of danger or despair. Her body ached from sleeping on cardboard, but she rose with the quiet dignity of someone who refused to let circumstance define her worth. The thermometer outside the building read 14 degrees. Sarah had learned to move quickly in cold like this, to keep blood flowing, to stay ahead of the numbness that crept through fingers and toes like a slow poison. She folded her blanket with careful precision, tucked it into her backpack alongside the few possessions she owned. A dented thermos, a paperback book with a broken spine, a photograph of her parents creased down the middle from being held too many times. The city was still sleeping when she emerged onto the streets, but Sarah's day had already begun. She walked 8 blocks to the Church of Merciful Heart, where they opened the doors at 6 for coffee and day-old pastries. The line was already forming. 15 people huddled against the brick wall, their faces drawn and weathered, each one carrying their own story of how they had fallen through the cracks. Sarah took her place at the end, stamping her feet to keep warm. That was where she saw him, old Timothy, struggling to stand, his arthritic hands fumbling with his walker. Without hesitation, Sarah moved to his side, steadied him, helped him secure his thin jacket against the wind that whipped between the buildings like an angry spirit. He nodded his thanks, his eyes watery but grateful. And she smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, despite everything. Inside the church basement, Sarah accepted a cup of weak coffee and 2 donuts. She ate one slowly, savoring each bite, then wrapped the second in a napkin and slipped it into her pocket. Outside, behind the building, a stray dog waited, a scraggly mutt with matted fur and ribs showing through its sides. Sarah had been feeding him for 2 weeks now. This nameless creature who waited for her each morning with patient, knowing eyes. She broke the donut into pieces, placed them on the ground, watched as he ate with desperate hunger. The dog looked at her with something that might have been devotion, and Sarah felt, for just a moment, less alone in the world. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just 1 click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. 20 stories above the city, in a penthouse that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. James Whitmore stood at floor-to-ceiling windows and felt absolutely nothing. The view stretched endlessly before him, glittering towers of steel and glass. The city reduced to miniature lights and moving shadows, beautiful and remote and utterly meaningless. Behind him, his assistant was confirming his schedule, a blur of board meetings and charity galas and carefully orchestrated social engagements, each one designed to maintain the Whitmore image, each one leaving him more hollow than the last. He was 24 years old, and he could buy anything, go anywhere, have anyone, and none of it mattered. The penthouse was decorated by designers who had never asked what he liked, filled with art chosen by consultants who saw only investment value, inhabited by staff who called him sir and never looked him in the eye. His father was in Singapore closing another deal, as he always was, present in James's life only through quarterly financial reports and occasional phone calls that lasted less than 5 minutes. But it was his mother's absence that haunted every corner of this immaculate prison. Eleanor Whitmore had died 18 months ago, suddenly, senselessly. An aneurysm that took her between breakfast and lunch on an ordinary Tuesday. She had been the only person who saw him, really saw him, who asked how he felt instead of how the portfolio was performing. In her final weeks, when she knew the headaches meant something terrible, she had held his hand in the hospital and made him promise something that seemed impossible. "Find real connection," she had whispered, her voice already fading. "Find someone who sees you. Not the money, not the name, just you," James had promised, but he had no idea how to keep that promise in a world where everyone knew his face, his fortune, his value on paper. That morning, he had made a decision. He would strip away everything, the name, the wealth, the protective barriers, and walk into the world as nobody, nothing, just another person struggling to survive. He would spend one night on the streets, in donated clothes he had purchased from a thrift store, with nothing but $20 and the identity he invented. Perhaps in the rawness of real struggle, he would find what his mother had asked him to seek. Someone who would help him not because of who he was, but because of who they were. His staff thought he was flying to Boston for meetings. His security team had been dismissed for the weekend. No one would know. No one would save him. For the first time in his life, James Whitmore would be truly, completely alone, and he had no idea that this decision would lead him to a frozen alley, and a girl whose kindness would break him open and rebuild him into someone worth being. James stepped onto the street at 8 o'clock that evening, wearing clothes that smelled like mothballs and strangers. A thin jacket he had thought looked appropriately worn. Jeans that did not fit quite right. Boots that were already rubbing blisters on his heels. He had imagined this would be uncomfortable but enlightening. A single night of mild hardship that would give him perspective and fulfill his mother's dying wish. He had no idea how profoundly, catastrophically wrong he was. The cold hit him immediately. Not the cold he experienced walking from his car to a restaurant, but a penetrating, vicious cold that found every gap in his inadequate clothing and burrowed straight to his bones. Within 20 minutes, his fingers were numb. Within an hour, his teeth were chattering uncontrollably. He walked without direction, trying to look purposeful, trying to blend in. But everything about him screamed outsider. He did not know where to go, where the shelters were, where it was safe to rest. The city he thought he knew became a labyrinth of hostile streets and suspicious faces. At 9:30, disaster struck. 3 teenagers, bored and cruel, spotted him in an alley, decided he looked like easy prey. They shoved him against a wall, demanded money, and when he fumbled for the $20 bill in his pocket, his phone clattered to the pavement. They grabbed the money and the phone, laughing as they ran, leaving James with nothing. No way to call for help, no way to end this experiment that had suddenly become terrifyingly real. The temperature was dropping. The weather report he had ignored that morning had predicted record lows, single digits, dangerous exposure levels. James began to walk again, aimless now, desperate for warmth, for shelter, for any place to escape the cold that was turning his fingers white and making his thoughts slow and confused. Across the city, Sarah was finishing her shift at the soup kitchen where she volunteered in exchange for dinner. She packed her bag, checked her supplies, the thermal blanket, the hand warmers she had been saving for emergencies, the matches wrapped in plastic. The temperature was dangerous tonight. She needed to get to her shelter quickly, seal the gaps, stay warm until morning. She took the back route through the alleys, the path she always used, the one that kept her away from the main streets where danger lurked. That was when she saw him. A shape collapsed against the dumpster, trembling violently, his lips blue, his eyes unfocused and glassy. Sarah's heart clenched. She knew hypothermia when she saw it. This stranger was dying, and she was the only one who could save him. Sarah knelt beside the stranger, her hands hovering over his shoulders, her mind racing through calculations of survival. She had 2 hand warmers left, the chemical kind that lasted 6 hours. Precious resources she had been hoarding for the coldest nights, for emergencies when her own life hung in the balance. She had 1 thermal blanket, the kind marathon runners wrapped themselves in, silver and crinkly. The only thing standing between her and hypothermia. When the temperature dropped below 0, she had matches, a small camping stove, half a canister of fuel. These were not luxuries. These were the thin line between life and death. Her safety net. Her insurance against the brutal mathematics of winter on the streets. The stranger's breathing was shallow, his skin pale as paper, his whole body shaking with violent tremors that came in waves. Sarah recognized the signs, had seen them before in Old Timothy last winter, had watched a woman die outside the subway station because no one stopped. No one cared. No one wanted to sacrifice their own warmth for a stranger's life. She could walk away. She could tell herself someone else would find him, that it was not her responsibility to save every lost soul in this frozen city. She could protect her resources, ensure her own survival, make it through another night. No one would blame her. No one even knew she was here. But Sarah could not move her feet. Something in her, something stubborn and unbreakable that her parents had planted deep in her soul before they died, would not let her leave this man to freeze alone. She thought of her mother's voice, gentle and firm, telling her that kindness was not something you gave when it was convenient, but something you gave when it cost you everything. She thought of her father's hands, rough and calloused, always reaching out to help neighbors, strangers, anyone who needed it. They had not raised her to calculate the value of a life against the price of survival. Sarah made her choice. She pulled the thermal blanket from her backpack, wrapped it around the stranger's shoulders, tucked it tight against the wind. She cracked 2 hand warmers, shook them until they began generating heat, pressed one into each of his palms, closed his fingers around them. She would be colder tonight. She would be more vulnerable. But this man would live, and that had to be enough. Getting the stranger to his feet took all of Sarah's strength. He was taller than her, heavier, his limbs uncoordinated and clumsy from the cold. She looped his arm over her shoulders, braced herself against his weight, and half walked, half dragged him 3 blocks to the Parker building. Every step was agony, her muscles screaming, her own body temperature dropping as the wind cut through her now inadequate coat. She kept talking to him, low and steady, telling him to keep moving, 1 foot then the other. Almost there. Stay with me. You can do this. The maintenance room entrance was hidden behind a rusted grate that Sarah had learned to pry open months ago. She maneuvered them through, pulled the grate closed behind them, guided him down a short hallway to the small room that had become her sanctuary. It was not much: concrete floor, exposed pipes, a single dim bulb that still worked when she flipped the ancient switch. But it was shelter. It was 4 walls and a door that locked from the inside. It was warmer than the street. Sarah lowered the stranger onto her cardboard pallet, piled her spare clothes on top of the thermal blanket for extra insulation. His shaking had not stopped, his teeth chattering so hard she worried he might crack them. She worked quickly, efficiently, pulling out her camping stove, filling her dented pot with water from a jug she had refilled that afternoon at the church. She lit the stove with shaking hands, waited for the water to heat, dropped in a tea bag she had taken from the soup kitchen. The tea was weak and bitter, but it was hot, and heat was everything right now. She held the cup to his lips, helped him drink, watched as color slowly, painfully, began to return to his face. He looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes clearing from the fog of hypothermia, and what she saw there startled her. Not entitlement or expectation, but wonder, pure, unguarded wonder. As if he had never been given a cup of tea before, as if this small act of basic human decency was something miraculous. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and broken. "Thank you," he whispered. "I thought I was going to die." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, already feeling the absence of her thermal blanket, the cold seeping through her inadequate layers. "You were," she said simply. "What were you doing out there?" He hesitated, and she saw something flicker across his face. Shame, maybe, or fear. "Just," he said slowly, "trying to survive. Like everyone else." They sat across from each other in that small concrete room, as the hours stretched toward midnight, the camping stove between them like a tiny hearth, its weak flame the only thing holding back the darkness. Sarah had made more tea, splitting the last bag between 2 cups, and they warmed their hands on the metal, breathing in the steam. The stranger introduced himself as James, just James, and when she asked where he was from, he said nowhere specific, moved around a lot, had lost everything recently, and was trying to figure out how to start over. The lie came easily to his lips. Too easily, and something in Sarah's eyes told him she did not entirely believe him, but she did not press. Instead, she told him her own story, her voice quiet but steady, the words coming like stones pulled from deep water. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 17, she said. There had been no other family, no one to take her in. She had bounced through foster care for a year, aged out of the system at 18 with $200 and a garbage bag full of clothes. She had tried, really tried, working fast food jobs and sleeping in her car until the car broke down and she could not afford to fix it. One bad month, one unexpected expense, one missed paycheck, and suddenly she was here, invisible to a world that had once promised her everything would be okay if she just worked hard enough. James listened with an intensity that surprised her, his eyes never leaving her face, and she saw something breaking apart inside him, some carefully constructed wall, crumbling brick by brick. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that struck her as odd, too honest, too raw for someone who was supposed to be a stranger. "You are the strongest person I have ever met," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. Sarah looked away, uncomfortable with the praise, with the weight of his gaze. "I am just surviving," she said. "We all are." But he shook his head. "No," he insisted. "Surviving would be doing whatever it takes to stay alive. You saved me. You gave me your blanket, your warmth, when you needed it yourself. That is not survival. That is something else entirely. Something I have been looking for my whole life." Dawn crept through the high window of the maintenance room, gray and cold, the kind of winter light that promised no warmth, only the confirmation that another night had been survived. Sarah woke first, her body trained to rise with the sun even when exhaustion pulled at her bones. James was still asleep, curled beneath the thermal blanket, his breathing steady and deep. The crisis of hypothermia passed. She watched him for a moment, this stranger she had saved, and felt a strange flutter of something in her chest. Not romance, not yet, but connection, the recognition that 2 lives had intersected in a way that mattered. She moved quietly, not wanting to wake him, and opened her backpack to assess what remained. A sleeve of saltine crackers, half empty. 1 apple, bruised brown on one side, but still edible. A bottle of water, 3/4 full. It was not much, but it was breakfast, and she had learned long ago that complaining about what you did not have was a waste of energy better spent on surviving with what you did. When James stirred, his eyes opening slowly, adjusting to the pale light, Sarah was already dividing the crackers into 2 even piles. She handed him his share along with half the apple, the good half, keeping the bruised portion for herself. He stared at the food in his hand, then at her, and she saw his throat work, saw him struggling with some emotion he could not name. "This is too much," he said. "You need to eat." "We both need to eat," Sarah replied, her voice matter-of-fact. "So we share. That is how it works out here." James ate slowly, reverently, each cracker a meditation, each bite of apple a gift he did not deserve. When they finished, Sarah began packing her things, moving with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She told him about the city's resources as she worked, the soup kitchen on 5th that served lunch at noon, The library on Westwood where you could stay warm and no one bothered you if you pretended to read. The church basement that opened at 6 for coffee. She told him which alleys to avoid, which cops would harass you and which ones would look the other way. Where you could wash up in public restrooms without getting kicked out. James absorbed every word, humbled by the depth of knowledge required just to survive. By the invisible geography of poverty he had never known existed in his own city. When Sarah stood, backpack secured, ready to face another day with nothing but determination and dignity, James saw her clearly for the first time. Not as a homeless girl, not as a charity case, but as a warrior. And he knew with absolute certainty that he was not ready to say goodbye. James caught her arm as she reached for the door, his touch gentle but urgent. "Wait," he said. Would it be okay if I stayed with you today? I do not have anywhere else to go." Sarah turned, studied his face. Those eyes that seemed too clear, too educated, that watched her with an intensity that felt like more than simple gratitude. There was something about him that did not fit. Pieces of a puzzle that refused to align. His hands, even after a night in the cold, were too soft, uncalloused, the hands of someone who had never done hard labor. His vocabulary slipped sometimes into formal patterns, words like profoundly and circumstances that felt out of place in the rough language of the streets. But his desperation seemed real, and Sarah had learned to trust desperation more than consistency. "Okay," she said finally, "but you keep up and you do not draw attention. The last thing I need is trouble." They emerged into the frozen morning together, and Sarah led him through her world with the confidence of a guide in familiar territory. The soup kitchen was already crowded when they arrived, a line of weathered faces waiting for hot food and temporary warmth. James stood beside her, and for the first time in his life, no one recognized him, no one deferred to him, no one treated him as anyone special. He was just another hungry person waiting for a bowl of watery oatmeal and weak coffee. He watched Sarah greet people by name: old Timothy, Denise with the twins, Marcus who sang gospel songs while he waited. She belonged here in a way James had never belonged anywhere, connected by shared struggle rather than shared wealth. At the library, she showed him her favorite corner. Third floor near the history section, where the heating vent blew warm air and the librarians rarely checked. She pulled a worn paperback from the shelf, something by Steinbeck, and settled in to read. James sat beside her, pretending to browse a magazine, but really watching her, the way she lost herself in the pages, the way reading seemed to transport her somewhere beyond cold and hunger. When she caught him staring, he looked away quickly, but not before she saw something in his expression that confirmed her suspicions. This man was not who he claimed to be, and sooner or later, she would discover the truth. They sat on a bench outside the library as afternoon faded into evening, the sky turning that particular shade of gray that promised more cold, more hardship, more survival. Sarah had been quiet for the last hour, her silence weighted with unasked questions, and finally, she turned to face him directly, her eyes searching his with an intensity that made James want to look away, but forced himself to hold her gaze. "You are not who you say you are," she said quietly. Not an accusation, but a statement of fact. James felt his heart stutter, his carefully constructed story threatening to collapse. "What do you mean?" he started, but she cut him off with a gentle shake of her head. "Your hands," she said, reaching out to touch his fingers, so soft they have never seen real work. "The way you talk, using words like profoundly and circumstances like you swallowed a dictionary. Yesterday, you did not know where the soup kitchen was, which shelters were safe. Basic things everyone on the streets learns in the first week. You move through this world like a tourist, not a survivor." James opened his mouth, closed it, his mind racing for explanations that would not sound like lies. Sarah watched him struggle, saw the panic flicker across his face, and something softened in her expression. "I am not asking you to tell me everything," she continued, her voice low and steady. "Everyone out here has secrets, things they are running from, pieces of themselves they want to keep hidden. But I need to know if you are dangerous. If helping you is going to hurt me, no. James said immediately, emphatically, leaning forward with desperate sincerity. I would never hurt you. I swear on everything I have, everything I am, I would never hurt you. Sarah studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against her instincts, her survival against her hope that maybe, just maybe, she had found someone real in this world of shadows and deception. Finally, she nodded, a decision made. Okay, she said, I believe you. But James, whoever you really are, whatever you are hiding, just know that lies have a way of coming out, and when they do, they hurt worse than the truth ever could. James felt something crack inside his chest. Guilt and gratitude tangled together. I know, he whispered. I know. They were heading back to the maintenance room as night fell, taking Sarah's usual route through the alley behind the Parker building. When 3 figures emerged from the shadows, blocking their path, Sarah stopped immediately, her body going still in a way that told James this was danger. Real danger. Not the theoretical kind he had imagined from his penthouse windows. The man in front was tall and scarred, his eyes hard and calculating, flanked by 2 others who looked hungry for violence. We heard you got a spot around here, the tall one said, his voice flat and cold. A warm spot. We want it. Sarah's hand found James's arm. Squeezed once in warning, but James stepped forward before he could think, some instinct to protect overriding his complete lack of knowledge about how street confrontations actually worked. She was here first, James said, trying to sound authoritative, trying to channel every boardroom negotiation he had ever witnessed. Find your own shelter. The 3 men laughed, a sound like breaking glass. And James realized with sinking horror that he had just made everything worse. The tall one moved closer, cracking his knuckles, and James raised his fists in a clumsy approximation of a fighting stance that probably looked as ridiculous as it felt. Then Sarah was between them, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Marco, she said, addressing the tall one directly, and James saw recognition flicker in the man's eyes. Your sister Denise, she is at the women's shelter on Oak Street with the twins. I helped her get a bed there last month. Remember? I got her connected with social services, got her food stamps processed. The man hesitated, his aggression faltering. Sarah pressed her advantage, her voice steady and calm. You take my spot. That is fine. You are bigger and stronger and I cannot stop you. But tomorrow I see Denise at the soup kitchen and I tell her what you did, how you threatened the person who helped her when no one else would. You think she is going to be proud of that? The silence stretched taut, dangerous. Then Marco stepped back, jerked his head at his companions. We will find somewhere else, he muttered, and they melted back into the shadows. Sarah waited until they were gone, then grabbed James's hand and pulled him quickly toward the maintenance room. Her heart pounding, but her face calm. Inside, door locked behind them, James leaned against the wall, his hands shaking with adrenaline and shame. I am sorry, he said. I almost got us hurt. Sarah looked at him with something like pity mixed with understanding. You cannot fight your way through this world, she said gently. You have to be smarter than that. That night, the adrenaline faded and left behind something raw and exposed. They sat in the dim light of the maintenance room, the camping stove between them again. But this time neither could pretend everything was normal. James kept seeing those men's faces, kept replaying his own useless attempt to be a hero, kept feeling the weight of how little he actually knew about survival, about courage, about what it meant to face real danger with nothing but your wits. He wanted to tell her everything then, wanted to confess that he was James Whitmore, that he lived in a penthouse 20 stories above her struggle, that he could end her suffering with a single phone call. But the words stuck in his throat, trapped behind the fear that she would hate him for the deception, for treating her life like an experiment. Instead, he told her something true, something that cost him almost as much. My mother died, he said quietly, the words falling into the silence like stones into water. 18 months ago, she was the only person who ever really saw me, who cared about what I felt instead of what I could do for them. Since she has been gone, I have been so alone. Surrounded by people, but completely alone. and I do not know how to find my way back to feeling real." Sarah's eyes filled with understanding, with recognition of grief that mirrored her own. "I know that loneliness," she said softly. "After my parents died, I kept waiting for someone to notice I was drowning. But everyone just kept walking past, like I was invisible, like my pain did not matter because I was not worth saving." They sat with that shared sorrow between them, two people from different worlds united by the universal ache of loss. Then Sarah reached into her backpack, pulled out her second blanket, threadbare and thin but still functional, and handed it to James. "You will be cold," he protested, but she shook her head. "We all carry cold," she said. "But tonight, we can carry it together." James took the blanket, wrapped it around his shoulders, and felt something shift inside him, some frozen place beginning to thaw. Morning came too quickly, and with it, the end of everything James had been building with Sarah. They were walking toward the soup kitchen, moving through the early crowds of commuters rushing to offices and coffee shops, when a woman in an expensive coat stopped dead in her tracks directly in front of them, her mouth falling open in shock. "James Whitmore," she said, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "My God, James Whitmore, is that you? What are you doing out here? Are you all right? Should I call someone?" James felt the blood drain from his face, felt the carefully constructed walls of his disguise crumbling to dust. He tried to speak, to deflect, to say anything that would make this woman walk away. But she was already reaching for her phone, already speaking in rapid, concerned tones about needing to contact his office, his security team, his father. Sarah stood frozen beside him, the name echoing in her mind like a bell that could not be unrung. Whitmore. James Whitmore. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. The billionaire family, the real estate empire, the faces on magazine covers and charity galas. She turned to look at the man beside her. This stranger she had saved, this person she had shared her food with, her shelter, her warmth, her grief, and saw him clearly for the first time, not a struggling soul down on his luck, not someone trying to survive, but someone playing at poverty, someone slumming through her world like it was a theme park, an experience to be sampled and discarded. Sarah stepped back, her hands trembling, her voice shaking with something between rage and heartbreak. "You are James Whitmore," she said, and it was not a question. "The billionaire, the heir. You have been lying to me this whole time." James reached for her, desperation in his eyes, but she jerked away from his touch like it burned. "Do not," she said, her voice breaking. "Do not touch me." The businesswoman was still talking, still trying to help. But James ignored her, his entire focus on Sarah, on the trust he could see shattering in her eyes. "Sarah, please. Let me explain," he said. But she was already backing away, already putting distance between them, her face a mask of betrayal. "There is nothing to explain," she said. "I gave you everything. And you were just pretending." Sarah walked fast, nearly running, and James followed, ignoring the businesswoman's confused questions, ignoring the stares from passers-by, who recognized the disheveled billionaire chasing a homeless girl through the morning streets. "Sarah," he called, his voice raw with desperation. "Sarah, please, just listen." She whirled on him in the alley beside the Parker building, her eyes blazing with tears she refused to let fall. "Listen to what?" she demanded. "Listen to how you thought it would be fun to play poor for a few days? Listen to how you used me as your little social experiment? Was I entertainment for you? A good story to tell your rich friends over champagne? Look at the quaint homeless girl who shared her crackers. How inspiring, how touching, past the caviar." "That is not what this was," James said, moving closer, his hands raised in supplication. "I was not testing you. I was testing myself. I was trying to understand, to find something real in a world where everything is fake. My mother, she made me promise before she died to find genuine connection. And I did not know how, so I thought if I could strip away everything, the name, the money, the privilege, maybe I could find what she wanted me to find." "And you found it," Sarah spat, her voice breaking. "You found it in me giving you my blanket while I froze. You found it in me sharing my last food. You found it in me trusting you with my story, my pain, my grief. And all along you could have ended this with one phone call. You have an apartment, a bed, heat, food, everything." Her words hit him like physical blows, each one true, each one unbearable. James felt tears on his own cheeks, shame burning through him like acid. "It was not supposed to be like this," he whispered. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," Sarah said, and her voice was quiet now, defeated, all the fight draining out of her. "You made me believe I mattered to someone. You made me believe I was not alone. And it was all a lie." She turned away, her shoulders shaking. "Go back to your penthouse, James Whitmore. Go back to your real life. Leave me to mine." James did not move. He stood in that alley, watching her broken posture, and felt something solidify inside him, a certainty that if he walked away now, he would regret it for the rest of his life. "No," he said, his voice firm despite the tears. "I am not leaving, not until you hear the whole truth." Sarah did not turn around, but she did not walk away either, and James took that as permission to continue. "My entire life," he said, the words coming faster now, desperate and raw. "Every single relationship I have ever had has been transactional. People want my money, my connections, my name, what I can do for them. My own father talks to me like I am a quarterly earnings report. My friends, if I can even call them that, they measure our relationship by what events I can get them into, what deals I can facilitate. Every woman I have ever dated wanted the lifestyle, the status, the Instagram photos. No one, not one single person since my mother died, has looked at me and seen just me." He moved closer, his voice breaking. "I kept my identity secret because I have never, not once in my 24 years, known what it feels like to be valued for who I am instead of what I have. I wanted to know if kindness still existed without a price tag. I wanted to know if connection was possible without transaction. And yes, I was testing the world. But Sarah, I swear to you, I was not testing you. You saved my life. You gave me everything you had when you did not know my name, when I could not pay you back, when there was nothing in it for you except the knowledge that you had helped another human being. That was real. That meant something. That changed everything." Sarah turned slowly, her eyes red but her gaze steady. "So what now?" she said quietly. "You got what you wanted. You found your authentic human connection. You can check that off your dying mother's wish list. Now you go back to your billions and I go back to freezing, and you feel good about yourself for learning a valuable lesson about poverty. Is that how this ends?" "No," James said, and his voice was fierce now, certain. "It was the first real thing I have felt since my mother died, and I am not walking away from it." Sarah stood there in the cold morning light, her arms wrapped around herself, her mind churning through everything he had said, trying to separate the lies from the truth, the manipulation from the genuine pain she had heard in his voice. She wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold onto the clean, simple fury of betrayal. But life on the streets had taught her that nothing was ever clean or simple, that people were complicated and messy and often hurt each other while trying not to drown themselves. She looked at James Whitmore, really looked at him, past the expensive bone structure and the soft hands, into the eyes that held a loneliness she recognized because she carried the same weight. His pain was different from hers, wrapped in cashmere instead of threadbare cotton, but it was still pain, still real, still a kind of poverty that money could not fix. But understanding did not equal forgiveness. And trust, once broken, could not be repaired with pretty words and desperate explanations. "If you want me to believe you," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "then prove it. Stay with me one more night. Not as James Whitmore slumming it for an experience. Not as a billionaire playing dress-up. As an equal. Someone with nothing who survives on nothing. No phone calls to your security team. No safety net. No way out except the same way I get out every morning. By waking up and choosing to face another day. James did not hesitate. "Yes," he said immediately. "Whatever you want. Whatever it takes." They spent that day in silence, moving through Sarah's routine with a tension that hummed between them like a live wire. She did not make it easy for him. She took him to the places she avoided. The shelter where you waited 4 hours for a cot that might not materialize. The food bank where volunteers looked through you like you were invisible. The public restroom where she washed her face and tried to hold on to dignity while people stared and whispered. James followed, did not complain, did not pull rank or make excuses. When an elderly man dropped his bag of groceries, James helped him gather the cans without being asked. When Sarah gave half her sandwich to a young mother with a crying baby, James did the same with his half. Actions, not words. By evening, something had shifted, not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it, fragile and tentative as new ice. The temperature that night dropped to levels the city had not seen in 30 years. The news called it a polar vortex, a historic cold snap, dangerous and potentially deadly. Emergency shelters opened their overflow facilities, but they filled within hours, turning away dozens who stood shivering in lines that stretched around blocks. Sarah and James huddled in the maintenance room, but the old building offered little protection against cold this savage. The pipes groaned and creaked, ice forming on the inside of the window, their breath visible even in the enclosed space. Sarah had given James the thermal blanket again, keeping only the threadbare wool one for herself, and when he protested, she had silenced him with a look that said this was part of the test, part of proving whether his words about equality meant anything. They sat pressed together for warmth, the camping stove doing almost nothing against the brutal cold that seeped through concrete and metal like water through a sieve. Hours passed. Midnight came and went, and slowly, terribly, James began to notice changes in Sarah. Her shivering, which had been constant and violent, began to slow, then stop. Her speech became slurred, confused. She said she felt warm, started trying to remove her coat. And James knew with sickening certainty that these were the signs of severe hypothermia, the same symptoms he had displayed the night she saved him. "Sarah," he said, gripping her shoulders, trying to keep her focused. "Stay with me. You need to stay awake." She looked at him with unfocused eyes, a small smile on her blue-tinged lips. "I am fine," she mumbled. "Just tired. So tired." James felt panic rising in his chest like floodwater. His phone was gone, but he knew if he left her to find help, she might not survive the wait. If he stayed, they might both freeze. And there, in his pocket, was the one thing he had kept secret even from himself. A small card with an emergency number, his head of security's direct line, placed there by his assistant before he left. Insurance he had pretended he would never use. He could end this. One call and a team would arrive within minutes. Ambulances, heated blankets, a hospital suite. But it would mean breaking his promise. It would mean proving Sarah right, that when things got truly hard, he would always choose his privilege over his word. James looked at Sarah, her eyes closing, her breathing shallow, and realized that some promises were meant to be broken. Her life mattered more than his pride. James pulled the card from his pocket with shaking hands, stared at it for one agonizing second, then made his choice. He ran from the maintenance room, up the stairs, out onto the frozen street where his phone had been stolen, but where a 24-hour convenience store glowed like a beacon 3 blocks away. He ran faster than he had ever run in his life, his lungs burning, his legs screaming, burst through the door and demanded to use the phone, offering the confused clerk his watch, his coat, anything. The clerk handed it over without argument, perhaps seeing the desperation in James's eyes. And James dialed with trembling fingers. "Marcus," he gasped when his head of security answered. "This is James Whitmore. I need immediate medical extraction." Parker, building maintenance entrance. Alley off 5th Street. Hypothermia case. Critical condition. 5 minutes, or someone dies. He hung up before Marcus could respond, ran back to Sarah, found her unconscious now, her skin pale as death. He wrapped both blankets around her, wrapped his own body around her, whispered promises into her unhearing ears. "I am sorry," he said over and over. "I am so sorry. Please do not leave me. Please." The security team arrived in 4 minutes, 3 black SUVs with medical personnel who moved with military efficiency. They lifted Sarah onto a stretcher, wrapped her in heated blankets, started an IV, moved her into a vehicle with the heater blasting. James climbed in beside her, refused to let go of her hand, as they raced through empty streets toward Mercy General Hospital. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, her eyes opening briefly to see James's face above her, tears streaming down his cheeks. "You broke your promise," she mumbled, her words barely audible. "Yes," James said, his voice breaking. "I broke my promise. But I could not break you. I could not let you die for my pride." Sarah's eyes closed again, but her fingers tightened around his, just slightly. Just enough to tell him she had heard, and maybe, just maybe, understood. Sarah woke to whiteness, sterile and complete, the kind of clean that existed only in places designed to fight death. The bed beneath her was soft, impossibly soft after months of cardboard and concrete. Warm blankets covered her, real blankets that smelled like detergent and safety. An IV dripped clear fluid into her arm. The heart monitor beside her beeped steadily, proof that she had survived. James sat in the chair beside her bed, his clothes rumpled, his face haggard with exhaustion, his eyes red from crying or lack of sleep or both. He looked up when she stirred, relief flooding his features, and reached for her hand before stopping himself, uncertain if he still had that right. "You broke your word," Sarah said, her voice hoarse but steady. "You called for help. You broke the promise." James leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and looked at her with eyes that held no apology, only certainty. "And I would do it again. I would break it 1,000 times. Your life is worth more than my pride, more than any test, more than proving a point. You were dying, Sarah. I could not keep a promise to a corpse." Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, but underneath it, something else. Something that felt like the first crack in a dam she had built around her heart. "You do not get it," she said. "Out there, your word is all you have. Trust is everything. Without it, you have nothing." James shook his head slowly. "No," he said quietly. "Without you, I have nothing. I spent 3 days with you and learned more about what it means to be human than I learned in 24 years of having everything. You did not see my money or my name. You saw me, just me, worth saving when I had nothing to offer. That is what I have been looking for my whole life. That is what my mother wanted me to find." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, the wall cracking wider. "And what did I get?" she whispered. "A billionaire who lied to me, who played pretend with my life." James met her gaze, unflinching. "You got someone who will never forget what you taught him," he said. "Someone who will spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the kindness you showed a stranger in an alley. Someone who finally understands that wealth is not what you own, but who you are when everything is stripped away." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of truth settling between them like snow. Finally, James spoke again, his voice careful, measured, like a man walking on ice that might crack beneath him. "I want to offer you something," he said. "Not charity, not pity, but opportunity. A job at the Whitmore Foundation, working with homeless outreach programs. Your knowledge, your experience, it is invaluable. People like me, we make policies about poverty without understanding it. You could change that. And with the job comes housing, benefits, the chance to go back to school if you want, a fresh start. But one you earn, one you deserve." Sarah turned her face away, her jaw tight with conflicting emotions. "I do not want to be your project," she said. I do not want to be the poor girl you saved so you can feel good about yourself. I do not want your guilt money." James leaned closer, his voice intense. "This is not guilt money. This is me recognizing that you have something I need, something the Foundation needs. You survived 3 winters on the streets. You know every resource, every gap in the system, every way it fails people. That knowledge is worth more than any consultant I could hire. You would not be working for me. You would be working with me." Sarah looked at him then, searching his face for deception, for the catch that always came with offers that sounded too good. "If I do this," she said slowly, "I have conditions. I want a real salary. Not some inflated number because you feel sorry for me. I want to be evaluated like any other employee. And I want to keep helping people directly, not just sitting in meetings talking about helping people. I want to still go to the soup kitchen, still know the people I am supposed to be serving." James nodded immediately. "Agreed. All of it. What else?" Sarah took a breath, the final wall around her heart beginning to crumble. "And I want honesty," she said quietly. "No more games, no more tests. If we do this, we do it as equals, as partners, as people who see each other clearly. Can you do that?" James held out his hand, and this time when she took it, it felt like a beginning. "Yes," he said. "I can do that." 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the conference room of the Whitmore Foundation, presenting her proposal for a new winter outreach program to a room full of board members who listened with the respect her expertise commanded. She wore professional clothes now, not expensive but dignified, chosen by her own hand with money she had earned. Her apartment was small but warm, filled with books she was reading for the college courses she had started at the community college, paid for by the Foundation's education program that she had helped design. 3 nights a week, she still went to the soup kitchen, still knew everyone by name, still carried that quiet dignity that had saved a stranger's life in a frozen alley. James sat at the back of the room, watching her speak with a pride that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with witnessing someone become fully themselves. He was different, too, no longer the isolated man who had stood at penthouse windows feeling nothing. He spent his days working alongside Sarah, learning from her, using his resources not as barriers, but as bridges. He had dinner with the people the Foundation served, listened to their stories, remembered their names. His mother's wish had been fulfilled in ways he never could have imagined. Not through finding one moment of connection, but through learning how to build it every single day. They had become true friends, Sarah and James, changed by each other in ways that could not be measured in dollars or status, bound together by the night they had both nearly frozen and both been saved. So, remember this, that kindness recognizes no class, no boundary, no difference between the person who gives and the person who receives. In that frozen alley, a homeless girl with nothing saw a stranger and chose compassion over survival. And in doing so, she saved 2 lives, his body and her future. Real wealth is not what fills your bank account, but what fills your heart. Not what you own, but who you become when everything else is stripped away. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that we are all one choice away from being the person who helps or the person who needs help, and that genuine human connection is the truest treasure we will ever find.